What's my maximum obligation, God? But really he's asking, what's the bare minimum I can get by with doing? Because Andrew's getting on my nerves. And don't even get me started with James and John. He's asking, Jesus, what's the threshold of my obligation to have to actually give grace and forgiveness? When can I actually hold a grudge? Jesus, you saw what they did. You heard it. When can I return action for action? When can I enact revenge? God, do you see what they're putting me through? God, do you know what I'm enduring here? When is enough enough? God, I know you said turn the other cheek, but I've only got two. When can I take action? And when we ask those types of questions, we're really not asking what our maximum obligation is. We're asking what's the bare minimum, God, I can get away with. And I love how Jesus then turns and he starts to tell this story. And he says that there's a king. And he wants to settle accounts. It's judgment time. It's judgment day. And there's a servant who comes to him that owes 10,000 talents. Now, talent is a term we don't typically use in America. We got our dollar. So what is a talent? What does it even mean? Because we come to discover this man owed 10,000 talents. But we also come to discover that there's another servant who owes the first servant 100 denarii. Well, what is a denarii? How does it compare to a talent? Jesus is intentional in the words that he is using. And I want to take the time for just a moment to point out what these are. You see, a denarii was a day's wage. In the time of the Middle East in which Jesus lived, a denarii equaled out to what a common laborer would make in one day. Stop and think about your life. Think about your job. Think about how much you earn in one day. That would be your denarii. The second servant owed the first servant 100 denarii. Now, it's easy for you and I in that context to get upset and say, yeah, I'd be ticked off too if somebody owed me 100 days' wages. But what Jesus is pointing out is the first man owed 10,000 talents. A denarii is one day's wage. A talent, one talent, was equal to 6,000 denarii. One talent was the equivalent of 16.4 years worth of wages. One talent. This man owed 10,000 talents. Do the math and it comes out to 10,000 talents equal 60 million denarii. 60 million days worth of wages. It would have taken that first man 164,383 years, working 7 days a week to pay back the debt that he owed. Jesus was making a statement here. He says, Peter, what you don't realize is that you owe a debt you could never repay. Peter, you think you're able, but in reality, you're the first servant. You owe a debt to me you could never repay, even if I gave you 164,000 years. You could never repay it. And Peter, you're wanting judgment, you're wanting vindication, you're wanting to be proven right, you're wanting to withhold forgiveness because your brother has wronged you. Man, your brother owes you 100 denarii. You owe me 10,000 talents. Think about that. So that first servant owed a debt that he could never repay. You know, the second servant owed a debt too. Here's the point. Every single one of us in this room, every single person watching this message online, you are the first servant. We all are. We all owe a debt that we could never repay. We all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We all have sinned. There's not one righteous, no, not one. And I love how Paul articulates this in Ephesians chapter 2. But even though while we were dead in our debt, dead in the trespass, dead in that debt of sin that we could never hope to repay, even while we were yet dead in our trespass, Paul said, God loved us. And he sent his son to die for us, to pay the debt that we could never repay. He is the good king. He is the forgiving Father. He wiped clean your debt. He wiped clean all that you owed and could never repay. But that man that had been forgiven, that debt that he could never repay, he turned around to his brother who owed him. Think about this. The debt that he was owed by his brother was 1/600,000th. That's hard. I'm not a math guy. That's hard for me to comprehend. It's 1/600,000th. That's the thinnest slice of pie out of the equation you can imagine. 1/600,000th of what he owed, he's demanding from his brother. And instead of giving the grace that he had been given, instead of extending the forgiveness that he had received, he grabbed that brother by the throat and he threw him into jail. And he said, stay in here until you pay me what you owe me. Pastor Mike, what are you saying? I'm saying what Jesus said in verse 35. Forgiveness is never optional. Forgiveness is never optional. You don't forgive because you feel like somebody has measured up. You don't forgive just because you feel like it. You don't withhold forgiveness just because you think somebody hasn't paid the price yet. Forgiveness is never optional. It's mandatory. And Jesus, he articulates this and he says, it's not optional, it must be given. If you do not forgive others, God is not going to forgive you. See, what you don't understand is you've already been forgiven a debt you can't pay. You have freely received that forgiveness, freely received that grace. How dare we withhold it from anybody else? Peter, you're so worried about your brother sinning against you. Have you bothered to stop and think about how you've sinned against me? You're so worried about the debt somebody owes you. Have you stopped to consider the debt I forgave you of? See, unforgiveness isn't an option. Unforgiveness actually leads to judgment and to torture. Unforgiveness, it doesn't simply bind the other person. Unforgiveness binds you. It keeps you chained. It keeps you locked. The master came back and said, you know what? You wicked servant. I forgave you a debt you couldn't repay, and now you're not willing to forgive somebody else? Because of your unforgiveness, you're going to remain in the same prison that you're holding somebody else to until you can repay me what you owe me. See, James 2:13 tells it like this. Judgment is without mercy to the one that shows no mercy. But mercy triumphs over judgment. Judgment will always be without mercy if you don't sow mercy. The grace you give is the grace you'll get. The forgiveness you give is the forgiveness that you'll get.